So, good afternoon. You're after the barbecue, before the barbecue? I can't resist mentioning food in this place. But maybe that's a good segue between bridging faith and modernity. Faith and modern day excess or food. So they tell the story about Lucy, who was studying biology, the origin of our species, and she comes home all confused. So she asks her mother, so where do we come from? Where do we originate from? So her mother's face breaks out in a beaming, warm smile, and she begins to share. She said, well, we had a grandfather from a small town in Poland, and a grandmother from a town in Czechoslovakia. And before that, a few generations back, we had a rabbi, great-grandfather, who composed a very important work in Jewish law, halacha. And the further back we go, the better it gets, to the point of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and all the way to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The best yichus, right? The best pedigree. When her father comes home, Lucy runs over to her father and asks him the same question. Where do we come from? And in stark contrast to his wife, his face turns all ashen, disturbed, and he said, I always rued this day. Sit down, brace yourself. And he tells her, well, we first originated from apes, and before that, from amphibians. And they are traced back to bacteria. And the furthest back we figured out so far is 14 billion years ago, a ball of gas. So you can imagine Lucy now is really confused. She got very different answers from her mother and then from her father. So she runs back to her mother and asks her mother, tell me, I don't understand. You told me one thing, Dad told me a completely different response. And her mother, without missing a beat, says, we both told you the truth. I shared with you my side of the family, and your father shared with you his side of the family. So there you have it. The ultimate reconciliation between science and the creationism and evolution. It depends which side of the family. And beyond the joke, is really up to us. Because we've seen in human history, we've all been witness throughout history and also in our own lives, that you have the choice. You can behave like an animal, you can behave like a human being. We can be selfish, self-absorbed, driven by self-interest, and in the process, me, step on others. Or we can choose to be selfless and giving and noble and kind and compassionate. As a matter of fact, we often have both things going on in our lives, and we have the choice every moment. Because as the mystics write, the Hasidic masters write, the book of Tanya, the whole theme of it orbits around this central point, that we have two souls, a human soul, a divine soul, and an animal soul. And the animal soul is driven by self-interest and what we would call survival, even survival of the fittest. And the divine soul is driven by transcendence and the need to make the world a better place and fulfill our calling and be compassionate and giving and so on. And these two voices are in conflict with each other all the time. And just look inside yourself. Every moment you make one of these two choices, either me or something greater than you. So what I'm going to talk about, obviously, is this challenge on both in a personal, microcosmic level and also on a macrocosmic level. Can these two worlds be bridged? Maybe someone can close the door there so we don't have the piano. I love piano, but everything has its time and place, So we'll be talking about this bridging of two voices, two worlds, both in the, as I said, in the personal level, as well as on the macrocosmic level, on the global level. Because it seems like two realities and paradigms that cannot be interfaced. The world of faith and the world of modernity. And much has been written on the topic. And I'll sum up some of the different theories and different approaches and try to suggest a third viable approach, which may be even surprising to some. So maybe one way this was very well vividly captured was a few years ago. You may remember the New York Times magazine had a cover story. It was called Orthodox Paradox. It was written by a professor at Harvard, Noah Feldman, if I recall correctly, who wrote this very provocative article, and in it he shares the following. He shares that he was recently at an a reunion of his class of Maimonides school in Boston. So they had a reunion, and of course, part of the reunion, they took a class picture, and to his chagrin, lo and behold, when they printed the picture in some journal that they had published, he sees that someone was airbrushed out of the picture. It was his girlfriend. And he was wondering whether the reason was because she was Korean. So this is how he begins his entire article, pointing out that obviously some people were uncomfortable with the fact that he was dating a non-Jewish woman, and very obviously so. So they decided to take her out of the picture. And he goes on a scathing attack on the modern Orthodox world that he grew up in, namely Maimonides school and other such environments, where he says they taught us to compartmentalize. I'm just summing up his thesis, his theme. They taught us to compartmentalize the best of both worlds, which was once known in the time when the Reform movement was born as a Jew at home and a guy in the street. In other words, at home, you're a devout Jew, but when you're in the public eye and in your professional life, you are like a non-Jew. And we were taught the best of both. We had Hebrew studies, taught us about our Judaism and the Torah, but we also had secular studies, which trained us to enter the Ivy League schools and become the best in the different sciences, the political, physical, and social sciences. And that's where I went on to Harvard and others to other such schools, where we became attorneys and business administration and law and doctors and so on. So we were taught to compartmentalize. Each one of us chooses different compartmentalization. Some choose not to wear a kippah when they go to their law firm, even though they wear one at home when they eat a meal. And they're observant when it comes to Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Shabbat, and holidays. But when they're with others, they're not. And some draw the line of who they date. So he's not really sure why this was so considered so crossing a line when their entire philosophy is built on compartmentalization. So you can imagine what kind of uproar this caused, especially in that world. In the modern Orthodox world, I remember Dr. Lamb from YU and others, leaders in the Jewish community, came out, of course, attacking him, saying you can't compare the two. A kippah is only a custom. Intermarriage is the foundation of Jewish life, etc., etc. But I very much was taken by the entire debate and dialogue and conversation, because to me it struck the chord of this issue we're addressing now. Can you bridge faith and modernity? Or are they antithetical to each other? Because you can make a very strong case for the compartmentalization argument, because you can say, for instance, just to use an example, let's talk about morality. In the secular world, in the Western secular world, what we call moral relativism. Morality is not absolute. What defines morality? The consensus at the time. There are things that were once considered completely moral that today are considered immoral. And there are things today that are immoral that may be considered by some as moral. As some things that are moral that some consider immoral. It's relative. When it comes to Torah and a faith-based morality, it's not relative at all. It's absolute. There are things, there's a line in the sand, this is allowed, this is not allowed. There are exceptions due to certain mitigating circumstances, like the threat of life or something like that. But there are absolute morality, not moral relativism. And I can go on to show on two different worlds. There's no way you can reconcile the two. You can't say moral relativism in the street and absolute relativism at home. Doesn't make any sense. So compartmentalization seems to be the only solution, because you have to find a way to live both lives. Like a dual life in a way. So that's one school of thought. That's how we deal with faith and modernity. The matters of faith belong in one domain. So when it comes to holidays, Shabbat, my children, my family, I follow Jewish religion. And when it comes to my business and professional life and social life and so on, I follow the guidelines of our modern world. To just drive the point home, this school of thought really began to develop actually in the 17th and 18th century, what we would call the time of the emancipation of the Jews. So some history could help. It's a very healthy way to understand the future by looking back at the past, because that's how we learn, how people dealt with different challenges. So what happened with the Jewish people? Big $1 million question. Everyone asks this question. 500 years ago, and I'm just choosing a number because it's a rounded number. 500 years ago, assimilation did not exist. There was no such thing as an assimilated Jew. There were the rare exceptions of baptized Jews, Jews who decided to convert, which was a rarity, and that was that. There was no opportunity to assimilate even if you wanted to. Jews were identified as Jews, or discriminated as Jews, overtaxed, constantly on the run. If it wasn't overtaxed, there was expulsions, or even genocides and pogroms. The history of the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years, until relatively recently, has been one of constantly being a basically discriminated against minority, to put it mildly. It took on much worse shape in most cases. There isn't a country in Europe that at some point did not expel the Jews. And that's not even counting the Nazis and all the other things we went through. So even if you wanted to assimilate, no one wanted you. Jews were not allowed into universities. They were not allowed into the modern culture. They weren't even allowed into the trades. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that Jews went into finance. Because they found innovative ways to make money. They weren't allowed to go into the mainstream trades, because they were seen as either Christ killers or however the discrimination justified itself. They were outsiders. It's not an accident the Holocaust happened. Eliezer Berkovitz, in his great book called Faith After the Holocaust, makes a case that the Holocaust could never have happened if there wasn't almost 2,000 years of institutionalized anti-Semitism. That created an environment that the Nazis exploited with their propaganda to take it all the way to the natural conclusion, quote unquote. Horrible conclusion, I should say. So what happened? How do we have now a rate of over 50% intermarriage and higher rates, 80, 90% assimilation in just a few hundred years? Meaning Jewish history, if you count from the time of, let's say, the Exodus, Passover, 3,331 years, to be exact. So 3,000 years, almost zero assimilation. I mean, there are periods in history that the Tanakh talks about, but I'm talking about especially after the destruction of the temple, and then suddenly such a turn of events. So you have to look at what happened. Something happened. What happened was, which is called in the language today of essentially modern history, that approximately in the 14th, 15th century began a thing called the Renaissance, which in turn led into the Enlightenment, which then turned into the emancipation of the Jews. What did it consist of? Briefly, was that up to that point, the church was a dominant force, like a dictatorship. Monarchs ruled. There was no such thing as what we call today freedom. There were no elections, there was no democracy, there were no Bill of Rights. Humans did not have rights. It was the monarch that ruled. And sometimes there was a church leader that ruled. Sometimes they worked together, and sometimes they didn't. This was the story of the Western world. Eastern world is another story. Jews really didn't live there, so it's not so relevant to our discussion. Then, you could say, the winds of free inquiry and open-mindedness began to blow through Europe, which of course led people, thinkers, to rethink this whole structure. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons that led up to that. It's not so relevant as well. But they began rethinking this type of absolute power by one or two families who may be totally corrupt. Who, of course, suffered the most under these absolute totalitarians were the Jews, because they were always the most discriminated against. So if we had a benevolent monarch somewhere, great. But if not, we were always at the mercy. Who was benefited most from the so-called Enlightenment was also the Jews, because the first effect it had was it weakened this type of authority, and people began asking the question, do humans have rights? And of course, Jews are also humans. And the Jews were the ones most deprived of rights. So if anyone was affected most, it was the Jews. So what happened was in the Jewish community, and I should qualify all this by saying, this did not happen overnight. We're not talking about a particular year or decade even. This happened over a century or maybe 2 centuries. So it's a lot of time. But when we look in retrospect, you can definitely identify the pattern. It's very clear. So the Jews were faced with a new reality they never had. They were suddenly, again, not suddenly, but they were in time, suddenly welcomed into a secular, I would say secular, let's call it a religious, non-Jewish world. What do you do now? Now you're no longer discriminated against quite the same way. So when you had no choice. What did Jews do when they were so embattled? They built very powerful Jewish communities. This was called the shtetl life in Eastern Europe. This was called life that was lived in a very, very tough conditions physically, but spiritually and religiously was very insulated, very immunized from outside effects. That's why there was no room for assimilation. Rabbis were very powerful. Many scholarship and piety basically controlled most Jewish lives. And that was the story. Now that there are new options, what do you do? So 2 schools of thought emerged out of this, again in time. One was in Central Europe, in Germany and France. What would be called later the birth of the Reform Jewish movement. As its name implies, reform, to reform Judaism. Now, I'm not here to give commentary on Reform Judaism or any denomination. I'm talking now from an observer status, just simply defining what happened as a result of this new challenge. So now, Moses Mendelssohn himself was an observant Jew, like everybody was. But he was enlightened, and he was an open-minded thinker, and he began articulating a new approach. It was around his time and a little later that term was coined, a Jew, in the home, and a goy in gas, a Jew in the home and a non-Jew in the street. But it spiraled very quickly from a traditional-based thinking to one that would, Abraham Geiger and some of the students of Mendelssohn took it completely to another level. They said, it's a new world, it's a modern world, we have now new opportunities, we have to rethink the Torah. And they basically proposed, until this day still embraced, the Reform movement embraced the concept to basically eliminate and erase all what they call the irrational mitzvahs, things of purity and impurity, things of mikveh, kosher, non-kosher, and retain the inspiring moral message of the Torah. Because of this new approach. And this became a whole new approach to Judaism. Now remember, there was no real communications then, so the word didn't really get out to other parts in the world so quickly, the word. Just to tell you how far it went, when the Reform movement came to America, they had a thing called the Pittsburgh Platform. And you can look it up. This may sound like a joke, but it's not. And they came out with 10 amendments. And one of them was that to move Shabbos from Saturday to Sunday. Why? Because that's what our Protestant neighbors do. Why do we have to stand out? We're all celebrating the Sabbath. Let's move it to Sunday. This was so radical, even to the most liberal voices in the movement, that when word got back to Europe and other places, it was never embraced. That's why you don't have that. Because at that point, people said, one second. So essentially, it's no longer Judaism. You might as well call it Christianity, for Jews. But the point I'm making is because once you start tampering, where do you stop? Once you start creating this compartmentalization, which was exactly the essence of it, we remain Jews in spirit, and we embrace the so-called moral and ethical values, but there's nothing else about it. The concept of sacredness, sanctity, that the Jews are sacred, that they're a sacred people, is a thing of the past. It's a primitive concept. Sanctity is when you're a fine person, you're a human person, you're a good person. So that attitude obviously changed the landscape, because till this day, the Reform movement is really the dominant movement in Judaism in numbers. It's waning and things are changing dramatically, but over the last few hundred years, that was the dominant movement. And, okay. There was another school of thought that was born a little simultaneously in Eastern Europe. When the Eastern Europe rabbis and Jews heard of what's happening in Central Europe, they took the exact opposite approach. The other extreme. That we see the modern world and all its benefits and blessings as a curse, as the devil. A theory based on the fact that the universe is now all our enemy. So we have to create our own blinders and ghettos, self-imposed. Once upon a time it was imposed upon us by our enemies, by other people. And now it's imposed upon us by ourselves. And this began what would be called ultra-orthodoxy. Ultra-orthodoxy that essentially has a different approach to modernity. That modernity is dangerous and forces of evil, and we have to completely avoid it. And this too has an impact till this very day, and you'll see communities that are driven that way, that are trying to build their own walls and their own self-imposed ghettos. And just to give an example, a few years ago, and again, I hope you don't take I'm not commenting my opinion on these movements. I think it'll be self-understood from what I'm going to say, but that's not my intention here, is to criticize. My intention is just to describe how people dealt with the challenge. It would be like you have your home, it's a very beautiful home, perfect, pure, refined, and then some people, some ideas start seeping into the walls of your home, and your children are exposed to it. So what would you do? Some would do is say, okay, let's take the best of it and try to compartmentalize and in some way integrate. And others would say, no, let's put up more walls, more burglar alarms, more filters to make sure that these influences don't affect our children. That's a simple way to sum it up. So a few years ago, you may remember, in Citi Field, which is in Queens, basically, it used to be called Shea Stadium. New York Mets play there. So there was a big conference led by the ultra-Orthodox movement. Essentially, a conference, a demonstration of over, I think, 100,000 people showed up. Was that the number? Something like that. It was a large number. And it was against to protest the ills and the evils of the internet. Now, the irony has not defied any of us. The irony that it was all broadcast on big jumbotron screens and on the internet. This anti-internet demonstration. And of course, they discussed porn and the other negative and bad influences and messages that our children and our adults are exposed to. I was taken by it in this context because it's a thing I think about all the time, how they're dealing with the internet. What better a model of modernity is than internet? How do you deal with internet? Unfiltered internet. And frankly, as many people testified afterwards, maybe it was a noble cause with good intentions, but no one really came up with any solutions. So you could say at least protesting it was also something. But then the cynics pointed out that the conclusion was that people should get filters on their phones and on their computers. Others pointed out that the people who manufactured the filters sponsored the event. So you can imagine what people's attitude to the whole thing was. Okay, it's like they say the radar, speed radars and the radar detectors are manufactured by the same company. So first they come to the police and they say, here's a great radar that nobody can detect. Then they develop a detector that's even better than the radar, and they come and sell that to the public. Then they come back to the police. You get the idea. It's the mouse is it's the manufacturers of mice are manufacturing mouse traps, basically. So I remember at the time dealing with this, understanding and talking to some rabbis, and it struck me this was exactly a capturing the challenge we have. That here the approach is that to demonize the internet, to demonize modernity, the fact that everybody's using it for business and it's almost impossible to excommunicate, well, too bad. And therefore, that school of thought has not found a solution either. So is there a third option? That's what I want to address. A third option of bridging faith and modernity. So let me tell you what happened right after that conference or demonstration, whatever you call it. So I know a group of rabbis that were there at the event, and we talk at different time, we have different conversations. And they said to me, so what do you think? I said, what I think is that, what was the point? I don't really get it. What was accomplished? And what would you propose? So I told them a story, and I'll share with you, that happened with me, that I was going to a Shabbaton many years ago to East Hampton, New York. I was driving Friday afternoon. I stopped for gas. As I stopped for gas, I fill up my car, and I'm about to get into my car. There's right next door to the gas station was a club, a parking lot, and there was a guy parking cars. And he came over to me and said to me, are you staying for the party? I'll park your car. So I said, no, I'm going to another party. And he said, what kind of party? I told him it's called a Shabbos party, Friday night dinner. He was very intrigued, so he started speaking to me about it. And, what is it? What do you do? So I told him I'm a teacher, I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, and I'm going to speak there. He said to me, do you have an email list? I said, yeah. He gave me his email address. He says, put me on the email list and send me your emails. I did that. I never thought about it again. The Shabbaton ended. I went back Saturday night, gave it to my office, the email address, and he started receiving the emails, and I never knew or thought that I would ever hear from him. Around 7 years later, something like 7 years later, I get an email from him. And he writes to me, he says, you probably don't remember me. I was this hick boy parking cars, and we had this conversation. And the fact is I'm Jewish, which you probably didn't realize. And I had a tragic story in my life because my parents died in a car accident when I was very young. I was moved to some foster homes, one to the next. My whole life was a nightmare. My schooling was no schooling, no Jewish schooling at all. And I know nothing about my Judaism. That's why I was very intrigued. And I have to tell you that since you've been sending me these emails have become my Judaism. And he begins listing. He says, a few weeks ago was Hanukkah, and I celebrated Hanukkah with your email. Shabbos, every week I read the chapter through your email. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, I don't go to synagogue. Your emails are my doctrine. And I saw from what he described that he really was doing it. He listed the whole thing. And I thought to myself, I said, wow. I was blown away. I realized right there and then, I said, who knows? Maybe the whole internet and the whole technology was created just for this one guy. I told this to the rabbis. I said, what would the likelihood be that there was no emails, that he would come to New York to a class of mine? I don't think so. But what does the internet allow? He could stay in his little corner. What does it cost me? Nothing. I add him to a list. One button that reaches 40,000 people, reach 40,001 people, or 40 million people for that matter. No extra cost, no extra effort, and you reach a person and you can change his life. Only technology allowed that. What does that tell you? That there's a third approach, which unfortunately these two schools of thought I mentioned before simply didn't get. The third approach is God created this universe, and He also created the environment for modernity. That doesn't mean everything about the modern world is good. But the fact that there is technology, who created technology? Not humans. Technology was in the beginning of time, just like electricity. To say it's evil is like saying the world that God created is evil. Depends how you use it. The Talmud has a fascinating dialogue. A philosopher asked Rabbi Akiva, if God doesn't want idol worship, doesn't want sun worshippers or moon worshippers, He should destroy the sun and the moon. What did Rabbi Akiva, a wise sage, say? Because of the fools, God is going to destroy His world. The sun and moon are not guilty. It's a poor person that's misunderstanding. So the commentary, the Tosfos Yontif asks right there and then, he says, why didn't the philosopher follow up with the next question? Why didn't God destroy the fools? And he answers, for obvious reason, free will. So the world is God's world. Every part of this world is divine. Humans are the ones that cause problems, not God. So the fact that there's modern opportunities should not be looked at as evil, should be looked at as exactly that, spiritual opportunities, and if we dig deeper, we can access and use them for divine purposes. And here's a perfect example that happened with me. I'll tell you what happened afterwards. I began hoarding emails. I became a email, whatever you call it, monster. So wherever I went, I asked for people their emails because I realized such an easy way. You get an email, you send a message, and it's amazing. So I told these rabbis, I'll get back to it a little later practically, but I told them, my suggestion is the following. You had 100,000 Jews gathered there. Most of them are going to use internet no matter what. Not at home, in business. Some people, if you can convince and you can get little children not to use a mobile, great. But most are not going to, the problem is not the children, the problem is the adults. So I said the following, you should suggest for every email you send, for business purposes, for social media purposes, for entertainment purposes, for nonsense, send 5 emails that share a warm, kind word with somebody. And you don't even have to write it yourself. You get something that you see and you pass it on. And then suddenly you're taking technology and using it to transform the world in a good way. And I remember the rabbi saying, wow, that's such a great idea. It wasn't even my idea, to be honest. This is how I was trained to think about the world, not as a threat to us, as an opportunity. So let's go back to the schools of thought here. So I summed up and I said, the challenge of faith and modernity, two worlds that clash. They clearly clash. What do you do? So one school is compartmentalize, the best of both worlds. And you got to deal with all the problems, which unfortunately are many, and doesn't really resolve the issue. As I said, it will spiral out of control because there's no way to bridge the two if you allow both of them full strength. The second school of thought, insulate yourself from the world and lock yourself up behind closed walls and just see it all as the devil and avoid the whole thing. Which frankly today doesn't work either, because you don't need a wall to get to a person. All you need is a phone. And there are no physical walls that can stop technology from reaching you. So maybe it could have worked 100 years ago, but today for sure not. And here's the interesting twist. This is I find this to be fascinating. Both schools of thought, as much as they're on two different extremes, extreme left or extreme right, they actually suffer from the same philosophical flaw. Can you guess what it is? This philosophical flaw is that the universe and the divine cannot coexist. So this one escapes to the universe, and this one escapes to God. So philosophically, the ultra-Orthodox are the same as the mistake that they make is the same mistake that the ultra-left make, which is you can't reconcile the two. So you have to either demonize one or escape into the other. That's what you do when you can't reconcile. And you'll find, by the way, in many political systems the same. Extremes are usually very similar. They just happen to be different ends of the spectrum. I once had to speak in a synagogue, and the guy tells me, the host, that this is a very split synagogue, either extreme left or extreme right. So I said, so what do you do? He says, you can't win, because whatever you say, the other one. So I'll tell you what I did. I got up, and I said, I hear that this community is very passionate and very opinionated, but I want to thank you all, because if there were no extreme right and no extreme left, we wouldn't know where the center is. In other words, if you want to know how to travel on a road, you have to have shoulders. The only way you can know a shoulder is by going to extreme right is here, extreme left is here, then we know where to travel. We know where not to go. You go right in between. Like the Rambam, Maimonides says, choose the middle path. But not because you're wishy-washy and you're compromising yourself, is because it's the healthy path. And what is the third path? The following. That there is no real fundamental contradiction between the universe and God, because God created the world. And when we say Hashem Echad, which everyone says, the famous liturgy prayer, the most famous prayer of all, Shema, Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Echad means one. So many to translate as one God is one and not many. Monotheism. It's much deeper than that. It's not there's one God and not many gods. There's one reality and not many realities. A very basic question. You could ask a child, you could ask an adult. Okay, if it's the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, today's Passover, so I'm not going to use today. Tuesday afternoon in a weekday, sometime of the year, is there less of God present than Yom Kippur in a synagogue in the Holy of Holies of the Holy Temple? What would be your answer? So I've asked this question to many, and many say, they get confused. They say, 1 second, it's a good question. Don't we say Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year? Don't we say the temple is the holiest place on earth? The Holy of Holies? The holiest place of all the holy places? So then what exactly does it mean? Yeah, what are you doing exactly? What do you do with God? How do you split God up in pieces? So there's less of God on a regular weekday? Obviously not. So the answer is, it's the manifestation of godliness. In other words, in a place that's a holy place is more conducive because there are less layers. Not because there's less God. From God's point of view, it's 365 days a year, every corner of the earth, one reality. But that reality manifests in different forms. So there are places where, yes, it's very hard to find godliness because people are behaving in a criminal way. That doesn't mean there's no spark of God there. It means that we are essentially rejecting God. As the Kotzker Rebbe, when he was a child, was asked, where is God? He said, wherever you let him in. In other words, he's there. It's like saying, where's your soul? Your soul is only one part of you? No, your soul occupies your entire being. But if you choose to behave antithetical to what your soul would like you to do, then obviously your soul has no place to express itself. So think of the soul as being like a potential energy that's not being able to be expressed. The same thing here. Godliness, and God is everywhere at all time. So there's no such thing, one fiber of existence to say that God is everywhere but except one little corner of the earth. You might as well say that God doesn't exist, because reality is reality. And you cannot split a unity into parts. So with that being, you go with that approach, then everything is different. Then if something happens in this world, let's say the advent of technology, or new opportunities that Jews can suddenly enter into the trades that once upon a time they were forbidden to them, or other opportunities. We're not talking about something that the Torah prohibits. We're talking about the opportunities of a modern world. So the first school of thought says, great, grab it, and if it compromises your Judaism, too bad. The second school of thought sees it as evil because it can lead to who knows where. And the third school of thought says, no, everything has divine energy within it. It's our job is to reveal it, is to unleash it. So your technology, yes, technology can lead you to places that are not exactly healthy, but technology could also lead you to touch people in ways that we never have done throughout our lives. So it forces us, what the modern world has done, has really forced us to dig deeper and access deeper understanding and appreciation of Judaism that once upon a time was not necessary because we didn't have the opportunity. And now we do. That changes everything. Now, what I'm saying now is really the basis of truly the Hasidic approach of Hasidic thinking, which sees divinity everywhere based on the Kabbalah. So there was a time that these teachings were not necessarily known by most. And maybe because it wasn't needed. When you lived in a shtetl, in a pure environment, so just the smell of the chicken soup in your grandmother's kitchen was very pure, and that itself can instill in you a certain amount of faith. That almost does not exist today. Today we live in a big world. We're exposed to every force, inundated more than we know, hyper-stimulated our senses by technology, by marketing, by all demands upon our systems. They say, studies show that by the time you're age 20 years old, in the Western world, you were exposed to 1 million advertisements. That's not a small number, 1 million. And it's not surprising if you start thinking about it, because it's everywhere. The subliminal messages and other messages. So what do you have? You have a situation where we are not a neutral environment. We're definitely not in a pure environment. So what do you do when so many things are attacking you? You can either take a defensive posture. As I said, you put up ghetto walls. You either take a posture, you know what, let me make peace with the enemy and compromise myself. Or you say, you know what, this forces me to dig deeper. And the best defense is offense. And realize that there's a God in everywhere. And you just have to find it. And you have to take the bull by the horns. Instead of feeling like a victim, what do I do with all these forces around me? And either I compromise myself or I'm threatened by them. No, you're a leader. These are opportunities. Teach your family, teach your community, teach the people around you how you use the opportunities of the modern world and tap into it and turn it into something glorious, something divine. Just to give you two examples, one example I want to give you of this. I was invited to speak at a medical conference a number of years ago. Now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not the son of a doctor. What I was asked to speak about was the medicine of the future according to Jewish thought. So what I shared briefly was this. I said, all disease, infection, death, of course, that we deal with today, from a Jewish perspective, is an aberration. In the Bible, in the Torah, it says that if Adam and Eve had not eaten from the tree of knowledge, there would be no death. People would live forever. And the logic is very straightforward. It's very straightforward logic. You know what it is? The soul has infinite amount of energy. So why would we ever have to lose the soul? It's not like an automobile, a car that runs out of gas. Gas is limited. Here you have a soul with unlimited energy. So why would it ever have to stop energizing a body? The answer is because the body is the problem. It wears down, and like an appliance, at some point, cannot contain the soul. So think of a cup of water. The cup of water, except for the forces of evaporation, there's no reason the water should ever disappear. Unless you puncture the cup. If you puncture the cup, the water will spill out. Same thing here. The body wears down due to Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, and therefore ultimately erodes, deteriorates, and dies at some point. But if you can fix the punctures, and correct and realign the material world to its spiritual source, soul to body, then there's no reason that there cannot be eternal life. That's the story, the so-called the physics behind immortality. And therefore, there will no longer be disease, death, and so on. So one doctor gets up and says, okay, so what will happen with all the doctors after Mashiach comes? So after the prerequisite joke I said was, maybe that's why doctors charge so much for a long retirement. I said, you'll do the most beautiful thing possible. The human being was created in divine image. Mipsari exhilarating, from my flesh I behold God. Instead of fighting and dealing with the pain and suffering of death and disease and infection, you'll be doing the most beautiful thing. You'll be teaching us the secrets of the divine that are embedded and in the anatomy and physiology and biology and chemistry of the human body. And physicists will do the same with physics. And astronomers will do the same thing with the cosmos. So in other words, the entire world is really an expression of the divine. That's Hashem Echad. So sometimes it's expressed in a holy way, during prayer, during Yom Kippur, during holidays, Shabbos and so on. And sometimes we have to express it through the material world in which we live. And that's a completely third different way of approaching faith and modernity. And that approach is based on understanding that modernity cannot be an enemy, the positive parts of it, to God. We just have to learn to tap into it, to look at every situation we face and encounter as an opportunity. So wherever you travel, whoever you meet, is not just a business opportunity, it's a divine opportunity. That's being on the offense, not on the defense. Then modernity does not become an enemy, it becomes an opportunity, a platform, a stage. And every one of you, everyone here, has your profession, has your sphere of influence, the places you will meet, the people you'll meet, the places you'll travel. So yeah, you can use it for business opportunities, for your own gain, for your own entertainment. Or you could see the divine hand has led you there. Mashem itzadigovr kenanu, God leads the footsteps of a person. You may think you're going there for vacation, or for business, or to eat from Bruce Backman's barbecues. And the truth is, God led you there in order for you to do some type of refinement and elevation and transformation. When you take an offensive approach like that, it's a whole different story. You're no longer dealing with enemies. Now, of course, there are going to be challenges. That's the material world. If we're faced with challenges. And there are things that are off limits. But there are plenty of things that we can tap into. And every situation allows us such opportunities. So that, my friends, I believe is the third secret solution formula to the bridging of faith and modernity, where we actually transform the world. We're not afraid of it, and we don't surrender to it. We transform it. It's a whole different approach that can have does have far-reaching implications in every aspect of our lives. You know, I never had such a large audience, but I know just for the record, it's for Mincha. Because the film was delayed, I started late, so now the Mincha community has arrived. And, well, you know, you had no choice but to hear a few words of mine. Maybe there's divine providence in that. And everyone have a good Yontif, good Moed. And thank you so much.